Hi everyone, welcome to Leading at a Local Level from Mission Life Grace. I'm here with my good friend Tim. Hi Tim, how are you?
I'm good.
Good to see you. Been up to anything interesting the last couple of days?
No, this morning I went to Tesco's to get the shop. As exciting as my life is at the moment, I'm afraid. Just my wife started to talk about Christmas. So,
of course.
Like we need to start pet shopping and all that kind of stuff. It's just life.
Let's not tell people that we're recording this in February. Oh man, that's great. Well, look, this is a second of our recent series, really, looking at people wisdom. So if you missed the introduction, do pop back and have a listen to that or watch it, because that is pretty much like just setting the scene for what we're talking about. But effectively, what we're talking about here is about how we help as leaders, how we lead people well. And we kind of introduced it last time, talking about this disconnect. Sometimes we see people who lead, who are maybe really godly, have real character, and maybe they're really competent. They've got great leadership skills, but there's a disconnect between, all of those things and actually the results that they're getting. There's a disconnect with people. There just seems to be some challenges with people. We gave some examples. I talked about Brian, I talked about Sarah. Tim gave an example as well. And we've seen it in our own lives where we've thought, all of this kind of potential, all of these ideas, and yet there's this disconnect between what we're actually producing. And we're saying that the gap there, the things that we're often not taught in any leadership training stuff that we do, is around people wisdom. It's about dealing with people. And the Bible frames that as being wise. And then we've come up with a model that we're going to unpick over the next 5 episodes. So Tim, do you want to pick up from there? Have you got the model just to remind us?
So there we are. Move to slide to the left. Slide to the right. Yeah, so we just said, John, absolutely. So we're saying that really there's a need to grow, for leaders to grow in wisdom, really, particularly in how to deal with people in the kind of current climate, current culture. And we recognise these 5 different components, which is being aware of what God is doing. That's the key. That's central to everything God is doing in your life, in others' life, in the life of the church, in the life of your culture. Being aware of yourself, of your struggles, your weaknesses, but also your strengths and how you might be perceived by others, those kind of things. Then it's being aware of valuing others, really understanding what other people feel, having empathy and care, but really not just being we all love people, but really understanding other people, understanding their perspective, stuff like that. And then there's this whole element of being able to manage your emotions, being able to, rein it in at points, but equally open up as well. We're going to talk about how you manage your emotions in a positive way, like when you are struggling, opening up to people. It's so important. And lastly, situational discernment, being aware of what the group is feeling, not just one individual, but just as a group. How's the kind of the moment, or as it were, like the kind of the feeling, the vibe in a group at that season, and being able to kind of effectively touch that and minister into that is important, really. So yes, that's our model. And today we're going to be looking at God aware, aren't we, John? That's the plan.
Absolutely, yeah. And just to say, we mentioned last time that as I sort of slightly slide back to the middle of the screen without anyone noticing, is that we talked about emotional intelligence, and there's a wealth of evidence that emotional intelligence is a real predictor for leadership, and we want to acknowledge that and say, look, that's good stuff. Okay, there is some good evidence there. We believe that all truth is God's truth, and that those things can be really helpful. But actually, in the Christian sphere, particularly, we're not just doing this to baptize this as a Christian thing, but because genuinely, the heart of all of this is being aware of who God is and what he's doing, and that this will have applications to our secular sort of workplaces, as well as our sort of power church, leadership that we do. But we really believe that that it all starts with God, that people wisdom starts with God, knowing his heart and his mind on situations, on people and ourselves as best we can. We've got to start with him, otherwise it becomes this very kind of self-centered, self-actualizing process. So Tim, you're going to sort of kind of lead us through this. I'm going to ask you some questions. Tell us a bit more about what this God awareness stuff is all about.
Well, I think you've done a really good job, John. I think the danger is, I mean, like, yeah. So from a secular point of view, there's loads of research, loads now, that demonstrates that high performing leaders are highly emotionally intelligent, and so there's a lot of training that's going on to kind of bring that kind of understanding into the workplace, I guess. But the danger is that that's why we don't want to call this emotional intelligence, because it becomes very self-orientated. As Christians, we're not self-orientated. It's not just about, there are points when you have to do things that are not the most people-wise, just because God says it. You get a sense that God is doing something, and sometimes you just got to be brave and lead out, and nobody is agreeing with you. And occasionally there are moments like that. And so that's why for us, God awareness is the center of everything else. You can't understand yourself or others, or be aware of the situation, or even emotions, outside of the Lord. You just can't. And so for us, that's key. But we want to really unpick what this means, don't we, John? I think this morning.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got a few points to go through. And so Tim, why don't you sort of lead us through them? Firstly, looking at, is it all about success or something else?
Yeah, so I think being honest, and this is just basic, isn't it? But really, we have to be secure and satisfied in God.
Yeah.
I mean, like, that is just, and I know every leader says, yeah, I know I need to be secure and satisfied in God, but in reality, that's such a challenge.
Yeah.
And being aware, and I suppose this is why being aware of God, it's being aware that God loves you. Yeah. So wherever you're leading, whoever you're leading, however successful or not successful you are in that leadership over the course of any period of time, it doesn't change how much God loves us, and it doesn't change the way God feels about us. And we say that to ourselves, we preach it to our congregations, we teach our home groups, but so many leaders fundamentally struggle to take hold of that simple but yet powerfully life-changing piece of information. And I think leaders are probably, they flick between either being, some people struggle, I guess, being more secure, and some people struggle with being more satisfied. And for me, my weakness is being satisfied in God. So I often, just being frank, I know, and I don't know if it's the same for you, John, but my weakness in leadership comes, and my people wisdom will lack when I realise I will, without subconsciously, I will start driving for success because I'm not satisfied in God, and I will push people when I shouldn't push people. Really, I'm not doing it because God wants me to do it. It's just because I somehow believe that my value, my satisfaction will come from having a bigger church or a more successful conference or whatever it might be. And I know that you're deeply secure and satisfied in God, so you do not resonate with any of this stuff at all.
No, I do. Trust me. Trust me, I do. And you're right. I mean, success is preached so widely, isn't it? What does it mean to be a successful leader? Successful in this, successful, have a successful church. What does that mean? And, we've mused on this before as to whether, I don't know, is God calling us to be successful leaders? We've seen the pitfalls. We've talked about that in previous podcasts, where the pitfalls where successful leadership has sometimes led to massive problems, massive character issues. So it's not about successful leadership. And I say that through gritted teeth because there's something in me that desperately wants to, I'm very drawn to all the kind of success metrics. But this really resonates with me because actually that security in God, and the satisfaction in Him, that actually, even if I'm wounded by someone giving me some feedback, which we've talked about before, but it's part of this, even if I become more aware of myself and probably aware of my sinfulness and my, things I don't do very well, actually to come back and know that I'm secure in God. Not that He's going to leave me as I am. He's going to take me. He's going to change me, and hopefully I'm going to grow and learn. But actually, it's so key. And I think John Piper's one of my big heroes, sort of theologically. But that's his catchphrase, isn't it? It's about satisfaction in God. It's the more we're satisfied in God, the more He's glorified. So it's about us glorifying God by being satisfied in Him more than the success we may or may not have.
Yeah. Did you see that? I've been hassling you for a while to look at the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast, recommending another podcast. And it's interesting. That tells the story of a guy called Mark Driscoll and his church's rise and fall. And I think so much of where that's gone wrong, I think, can be traced really with a sense of just, I think, his own security and satisfaction in God. And he was rather than, almost the mission overtook, and then rather than just being content, it was always more, and the harm that he's done to so many people, clearly from the podcast. I mean, I'm not a person. I mean, I don't know anyone personally, but from what this, you realise that's the danger of a leader who isn't necessarily secure or satisfied in God and content. So I think that's the first thing. I mean, I guess most people know that, John. So should we move on to the next one?
Yeah, let's do the next one. Go for it. Number 2.
Number 2, I think you need to be aware. I think if you're, talking about being people aware, is being aware of the spiritual season you're in. And this might seem like a funny one, but I know there are times when God is dealing with things in my life, and those things may or may not relate to my leadership. So, for example, I know that there's been a season where God has challenged me to be more patient. And I just need to be more patient. And so therefore, even though it might be that, I look and I think, yeah, but come on, we've got to drive things on, we've got to drive stuff on. I just got to realize God is saying, just be patient, take time, don't rush at this, don't rush at that. And I think if you're not aware of that sense of what God is doing season by season, and this is not an exact science, you know what I mean? But I think I realize that if I'm aware of what God is doing in me, that actually helps me to be able to handle people better. Do you know what I mean? So when a problem comes along that really gets on my nerves, sometimes I'm like, actually, hang on a second, that's a teaching, that the Lord is bringing that into my path to teach me something. And maybe I don't need to respond and react to that. Maybe that's more about me than it is about, trying to fix that person or fix that situation. Does that make sense to you, John?
It does. No, it does. And it makes me think, as you're leading, I mean, you're sort of leading a church, but for those listening, it might be you're leading a smaller group of people. But how do you differentiate between what God's doing in you very sort of personally and how much that may link to your leadership, if that makes sense? What God's doing in you. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, well, that's a hard one, I think. And I think often my problem as a leader, I guess other people have this same thing, is that I immediately translate, if God's speaking it to me, he must be speaking it to everybody else.
That's right.
And because I have a platform I will articulate from the platform, whichever platform that is, whether it's a preaching platform or a leadership meeting, whatever. I will use my platform to make everybody else think that
God's speaking to you to us as a church about impatience.
Exactly. And I think that's why you have to just be aware of asking that question. God is doing this in me, or I'm feeling very challenged on this, but I need to listen to what God is doing in other people, because without that, there's a danger that it all becomes about me. So the church basically follows my spiritual journey, whatever that might be. So I know I've heard other churches have said this, that they've had a leader or several leaders, but one particular leader, they said, well, it was just, he'd go through cycles every 2 years. It would be like he'd be really into this thing, and then he'd move on to that, and so all of our programs, our activities, would change based on what he was then interested in, and it would be a fad, and we'd move on to the next one, and they'd even say to each other, "Oh, it's all right, don't worry, we're coming. We've been doing this for 18 months now. It'll be over soon." And you think, kind of, that's not necessarily that helpful. And I think you've got to be aware that you can't necessarily drag the church based on what we're doing on you, or in you. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And yet, and I think it's going to your third point, there are times when we are called to sense what God is doing, in your church or organization, isn't it? So,
I mean, wonderfully segues, John. Prophetic awareness of God's bigger plans. And I think, absolutely. I mean, you've been leading in CMF, haven't you? And you've had to restructure over the course of the last few years, your whole approach to volunteers, really, and create teams and volunteers. And that's come not just because God's been speaking to you, and often there's a join up, isn't there? God was speaking to you about, local teams and people being empowered and equipped. And at the same time, the organisation was just finding itself, losing touch with its kind of membership a little bit. So really, with some external input, you became aware that really that was what God was speaking, wasn't it? And so
that's right.
It's this joining up together of like what God is doing in me, what God is doing in other, and what God is doing in the church or in the organisation that really brings the sweet spot, I think.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think there's probably not much more to be said than that, actually, that's the looking to what being aware of what God is doing more broadly. It might even be even more broadly in culture, and where sort of, for me as an organizational leader, where we fit in, what God's doing through other organizations. What is he saying to us about our part in, this particular cultural debate that's happening at the moment, and just being sensitive to the Spirit's leading in that is a wonderful thing, actually, as Christians, that we can do that, and we do that not as on our own as leaders. I very much, there are people within CMF who I will pray with and will really welcome their advice, their prophetic input, really. That's not always my gift. I sometimes think, I'm not much of a prophet. I'm not sure I can always discern these things. And I say, Lord, bring around me people who can help me with that, sense what you're doing, what you're saying at this time.
Yeah. And I think this is, and when we get to at the end of this, we're going to talk about how do you actually outwork some of this in practice. And it comes back to people. I will invite people into my own life and into the church, from a distance, to say, well, what do you think the Lord is speaking? What do you think the Lord is saying? Inviting local people in my church. What do you think God is doing? Because you often hear that, not just for you. And I think this is the key point with this. Being God aware does not come simply from you just sitting on your own, praying. That's where a lot of it comes from. But it has to be, you have to hear the joining up of the Holy Spirit in other people. Otherwise, there's a danger that all you're doing is you're just aware of what God is doing in your life and what's happening in your moment. And you're not people wise, because you're not sensing actually this is what God is doing in people. So,
absolutely. And then fourth and finally, Tim?
Yeah, so I love this. This is my favourite part of being God aware. I love to spot what God is doing in other people. So, I regularly enjoy, as John's experienced, sometimes just sort of saying, it seems to me that you're just a bit frustrated at the moment with this situation. I think God might be moving you into something new here, or, you see someone share a testimony in a meeting and you suddenly see in them, you're like, that's the gift of, you've got a gift of encouragement. Or, someone just loves, you see someone worshipping in a meeting and you just see them just abandoned to God. You think they're a worshipper, like I see that in you. Or, and I think, so much about being God aware and being people wise is being aware of not just their strengths and weaknesses, but what God is doing in their life. And this is the most exciting part for me. It's like I'm aware of what God's doing in me, what God's doing in us as a group, but I'm aware and I see little, and so often it's kind of hidden, it's small, and your job as a leader is to see it and to elevate it, I guess. So
I remember us walking through Blue Water, I think it was, Tim, and I remember just a comment you made, and it's really stuck with me, about how so oftentimes we can look to say, what is God saying? What does he want me to do? Will God just tell me like what what I should be doing, And you said, well, actually, so oftentimes that's already there. It's about uncovering it. It's about bringing that out. And I thought that is so true. And I tell you what, it's my favorite as well, because that's part of what I do. My work is helping people to see, Ephesians 2:10, the good works that God has prepared in advance for them to do. And as you say, it can be sometimes very subtle, and people often perhaps don't see it themselves. But when you see somebody you think, wow, you've got a gift of hospitality, or you've got, as you say, a gift of encouragement, or, well, it's clear that you've got a passion and a heart to serve cross-culturally, whatever it might be, actually saying, look, asking some questions, maybe God's doing that in you. Perhaps that's a desire that God's put on your heart from when you were a small child, and you're searching for all the other things, but why not this thing? Why not pursue this thing? So I love that.
It's almost, it can even be as practical as, I walked into a lady in our church's house, and she's not the most kind of, sort of outgoing, kind of forward type person, kind of, I think probably naturally a bit shy. And I walked in and it was as simple as, this is a huge front room. And I was like, this is a huge front room. And you often, this lady's lovely, and she's just, but probably wouldn't have the confidence to invite lots of people around her house. I was like, we're going to do home groups at your house. And I sense that this is God opening you up. And it was. It's been brilliant. It's been brilliant for her. And it's like, it can just be like that. And again, talk about being people wise. It's seeing like that. So taking that as an example, right? So, I see that God is wanting to include more people in our church. That's one thing that the Lord's been saying. I want to grow people in your church, people that, would often be overlooked. I want them to flourish. And I'm like, brilliant. I see God is doing that. And then you see the kind of the sense of which, like, you know, you see this person's house, you think, yeah, and you release that, and it's like, this is great. And then, you know, I'm secure enough and satisfied enough that even if it doesn't work, you know, do you know what? Yeah. It's okay. And it's those things coming together that it's like, you know, people now, that lady's more engaged, she's happier, she feels like she's got a purpose and a place, she's more connected. That disconnect has been joined, and it's like, to me, that's the magic. That's sorry, not magic.
Quick disclaimer.
It's the secret sauce in the middle of it. It's that people wisdom. It's spotting, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So as we finish, let's think about how do we become more God aware. And you mentioned, I think one key part there is actually as leaders deliberately looking and praying and asking God to show us what he's doing in and through them. As you say, it might be very practical, like, big front room, or, wow, you're an amazing cook, or you sing really well. But so that's one thing, I suppose, isn't it? Tell us some more, Tim, that you've been thinking about.
Yeah, so I think often, again, I think a lot of it's about, you know, just having time to ask yourself the hard questions. So I think you and I do this as a general practice quite often. You know, you are more structured and I do it more kind of ad hoc, but we both do it very regularly, really. Like, would I be satisfied if all of this fell apart? Like, when was the last time you really sat and asked yourself that question and really dug yourself in and said, you know, if this all comes to pieces, if I serve in River Church for the next 10 years and there's still only, like, you know, there's 30 people and we end up with less people than we had, will I sit and think, do you know what? Yeah. Like, I'm still satisfied in the Lord. I'm still secure that he loves me. And I think it's important to sit and do that. So I think that's the first thing I do. Yeah. You do that, don't you, John?
Yeah, I do. But as even as you're saying it, I think there's times where I can skim over it. And you're right. Sometimes you can't beat just time. You know, time with God. Books won't help you. It's time. Yeah.
And I think that's the first thing. I think often I think a great thing to do is praying with other people, particularly people you trust, maybe the whole church at points. You know, so your home, maybe take a home group. You know, let's just really pray. We've got a new season coming up after Christmas. Why don't we just spend this evening just praying about, or at least a half an hour portion, or maybe depending on the maturity of your group. What is God speaking to us? And you know, encourage people to you know, to say out what they feel God is speaking, you know. And it's amazing how that exercise, again, it's people wisdom. You're giving people the opportunity to be involved, to be included, to be valued, to share their thought, and you know, and you bring it together, and actually out of that, something powerful can come that you wouldn't have necessarily anticipated. And I think it's really important, really trusting people, I think. And I think the last thing that I do a lot of, and I think is good, and like, John, you're coming to our elders in a few weeks, aren't you? And we're going to, you know, we just asked John to come to work with our elders, just to help us think through the next season. You know, what is God doing in the next season for us? And just John's not got the answers, but John, because as some of you might know, John's a qualified or coach, and so he's just going to be doing a bit of, like, just challenging us and asking us those questions. So it's very practical. A lot of this stuff. And really, your job as the coach is not to tell us what to do, but to help us understand what is God saying, isn't it? What, being God aware.
Absolutely. Yeah. What is God doing already? How can we, talk about that and be more aware of that? So, looking forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. It'll be exciting. Who knows what God will say? So that's good.
That's right. Well, Tim, I think that's great. I mean, I think we're good for time. I mean, I think that's probably a good place to pull things together today. Looking at the first of our kind of concepts, the very central one on that diagram, God awareness, and we're going to unpack. In our next episode, we're going to think about self-awareness. So don't miss that. We look forward to seeing you there. This has been another episode from Leading at a Local Level from MLG. See you next time. Thanks, Tim.
Next time. See you then.
Bye.
Bye.